On an April morning in 1721, a ship called the Seahorse dropped anchor in Boston Harbor. It carried mail, cargo, and something no one could see. Within weeks, the busiest port in British America was emptying itself. Families loaded carts and fled to the countryside. Shops closed. Ministers preached to half-empty pews. And in the houses that stayed shut, people were dying in a way that everyone in that century knew by heart. It started like a bad fever. Then the back pain came, so deep that grown men wept. Then the mouth filled with sores, and the rash arrived. Face, arms, hands, the soles of the feet. The pustules rose together like grains under the skin. In the worst cases, they merged into a single sheet of raw flesh, and the smell of the sickroom was so distinct that nurses could diagnose it blindfolded. Parents held children who could not swallow. Survivors woke up blind. Those who lived carried the map of it on their faces forever. Before the year was out, roughly half of Boston had been infected. About 850 people were dead, more than 1 in 7 of everyone living there. And in the middle of that panic, one man kept saying something that made his neighbors want to kill him. He said the disease could be stopped, not by prayer, not by quarantine, not by medicine, by deliberately giving it to healthy people. He hadn't learned it from a doctor or a university or a book. He'd learned it from a man he owned. And amidst all that chaos, what you know today as a vaccine emerged. The world that lived with the pox. To understand why a Boston minister was willing to be hated, you have to understand what smallpox actually was, not as a word in a textbook, but as a fact of ordinary life. For most of recorded history, smallpox was simply part of the human condition, the way weather is part of the human condition. It was not an exotic plague that arrived and left. It circled back, generation after generation, and it took its share. In 18th century Europe, it killed something on the order of 400,000 people every year. In the unprotected, it killed roughly 3 out of every 10 it infected, and in some populations meeting it for the first time. Far more than that. It blinded a large share of those it spared. In many European cities, 1/3 of the blind had been blinded by this one disease. Imagine planning a life around that. Parents in that era often did not count their children as fully theirs until the children had survived it. Marriage negotiations asked whether a young woman had already had the pox, because a face without scars was a face that had not yet been tested. Runaway notices and ship manifests describe people by their pockmarks, the way we describe someone by height. The scars were a kind of certificate. They meant you had already paid, and the disease would never come for you again. That last detail matters more than anything else in this story. People noticed, thousands of years before anyone understood why, that smallpox only took you once. Survive it, and you were free for life. You could nurse the dying without fear. Nobody knew what caused it. Nobody knew what a virus was. The word wouldn't mean what it means now for another century. But everyone knew the rule, that somewhere inside the body of a survivor, something had changed permanently, which left one question, brutally simple, hanging unanswered for most of human history. If surviving it protects you forever, is there a way to survive it on purpose? Medicine had nothing. It's tempting to imagine that doctors were working on this. They weren't. Not in any way we'd recognize. 18th century medicine had inherited a theory of the body built on balance. 4 humors sloshing around, needing correction. Under that theory, smallpox wasn't an invader. It was an eruption, the body expelling something impure that had been inside you since birth. And if the disease was the body doing its job, then the physician's job was to help it along. So they helped. They bled patients who were already dehydrated. They purged them. They wrapped them in red cloth and hung red curtains in the sick room, because red was thought to draw the eruption outward. Some kept the room sealed and stifling. Others threw the windows open in midwinter and let the patient freeze, which at least did less harm than the bleeding. None of it worked. It could not work. There was nothing to correct. Which meant that when smallpox came to a town, the only real tools were the medieval ones: run or wall it off. Boston had a system. Ships were inspected. Infected houses got a red flag nailed to the door and a guard posted outside. Families were sealed in with the sick. It slowed the disease sometimes. It never stopped it, because a person is contagious before the rash makes them obvious, and because you cannot quarantine a port city that lives on ships. So the pattern repeated. A vessel arrived. A sailor felt tired. 6 weeks later, a town was burying its children. That was the world. Not a world without medicine. A world where medicine had confidently organized itself around an idea that was wrong, and where a farmer's observation was worth more than a physician's diploma. Keep that in mind. It explains almost everything about the fight that's coming. The knowledge that was already old here is the part that gets left out of the schoolbook version. The idea of giving someone a controlled dose of smallpox was not invented in a European laboratory. By the time Europeans encountered it, it was already ancient, and it existed in several places at once, developed by people who had no contact with each other and no theory to explain what they were doing. In China, physicians had been practicing a technique for centuries. Take the scabs from someone with a mild case, let them age until they weakened, grind them into powder, and blow the powder into the nostril of a healthy child through a silver tube. Right nostril for boys, left for girls, according to some accounts. A detail with no medical basis that tells you how much of this was craft and custom rather than science. Practitioners guarded their scab supplies and their aging methods like trade secrets because they had figured out, empirically, that fresh material from a severe case was dangerous and old material from a mild case was usually safe. In West Africa, communities practiced their own version. A thread or a lancet was passed through a pustule and then drawn through a small cut in the skin of a healthy person. The result was a mild illness, a handful of pox, and lifelong protection. It was common enough that the scar it left was recognizable and horribly valuable. Slave traders looked for it. A captive who had already survived smallpox or been deliberately protected against it was worth more because they wouldn't die in the hold. In the Ottoman Empire, older women performed it as a trade. They went house to house in the autumn with a nutshell of matter from a mild case, opened veins with a needle, worked a drop in, and covered it with a shell. Families gathered for it. It was called engrafting, the way you graft a branch onto a tree. 3 continents, 3 unrelated traditions, the same underlying discovery. A small, controlled dose through the skin produced a mild disease, and a mild disease bought permanent freedom. For centuries, European medicine did not know this existed, because European medicine did not consider these people worth asking. The 2 people who forced Europe to listen, that began to change because of 2 individuals. One an aristocrat, one an enslaved man. And it's worth noticing how similar their positions were, and how different. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was the wife of the British ambassador in Constantinople. She had reason to care. Smallpox had killed her brother. It had come for her too and left her alive but scarred, her eyelashes gone. In 1717, she watched the engrafting women work and wrote home about it with something close to fury. Fury that a procedure this simple was ordinary here and unknown in London. She had her own young son engrafted in Constantinople. When she came home and smallpox broke out in London in 1721, she had her daughter engrafted in front of witnesses from the College of Physicians. She was, in effect, offering her own children as evidence, because she knew that nothing less would move the men in charge. That same year in Boston, a minister named Cotton Mather was making the same argument, from a very different source. Years earlier, he had asked the man he held in slavery, a man he called Onesimus, whether he had ever had smallpox. The answer, as Mather recorded it, was both yes and no. Onesimus described an operation performed on him in Africa, a cut, a small dose, a mild sickness, and permanent safety. He showed Mather the scar. Mather asked around among other enslaved Africans in Boston and heard the same account again and again. Then Mather read a report in the Royal Society's journal describing the identical practice in Turkey. Two completely separate worlds telling him the same thing. Sit with that for a moment. Two of the most consequential pieces of medical intelligence to reach the 18th century arrived through a woman whose testimony was discounted because she was a woman, and a man whose testimony was discounted because he was enslaved. The knowledge was available for decades before anyone with authority acted on it. Not because it was hidden, because of who was holding it. Boston, 1721. When the seahorse brought smallpox into Boston in April of 1721, Mather was ready with an answer nobody wanted. He circulated a letter to the town's physicians laying out the case for inoculation. Exactly one of them said yes. Zabdiel Boylston, a surgeon with no university degree, who had survived smallpox himself and had watched it kill people he could do nothing for. On the 26th of June, Boylston tested it the only way a man could test it then. He inoculated his own 6-year-old son, Thomas, and 2 enslaved people in his household, Jack and his young son. All 3 developed mild cases. All 3 recovered. None were disfigured. The reaction was not gratitude. It was rage. And the rage, it's important to say, was not stupid. Look at what Boylston was actually proposing. 1. He wanted to take live smallpox from a sick person and cut it into a healthy one. If he was wrong about the dose, he would kill a child who had been perfectly well that morning. 2. The people he inoculated genuinely had smallpox. Mild smallpox, but real smallpox. And that meant they were contagious. Without strict isolation afterward, an inoculated patient could seed a fresh outbreak among people who had never consented to anything. 3. The evidence for all of it came from Africa and Turkey, filtered through a minister with no medical training, in a town that had watched that same minister help send people to the gallows during the witch trials a generation earlier. Boston's one university-trained physician, William Douglas, made the second argument loudly and in print. And on that point he was right. Boylston was not isolating his patients rigorously. He inoculated people and let them go home. Douglas's objection was a real objection, and history has been a little unfair to him for it. But the argument didn't stay on the merits. Newspapers called Boylston a quack. Ministers argued from the pulpit that the disease was God's judgment and that dodging it was defiance. Racism ran under all of it. The idea that a technique from African and Turkish practitioners could teach English medicine anything was, to many Bostonians, self-evidently absurd. The selectmen summoned Boylston and ordered him to stop. He kept going. He was threatened in the street. After one of his patients died, he hid in a concealed room in his own house for the better part of 2 weeks, while men searched for him. In November, someone threw a lit device through Cotton Mather's window with a note tied to it, promising to inoculate him with this, with a pox to him. The fuse broke on the way in. It didn't go off. That's how the modern era of immunization began. Not with applause, with a bomb. The number that ended the argument Boylston did something else, though, and it turned out to matter more than the surgery. He kept records, names, dates, outcomes, for every single person he inoculated. By the time the epidemic burned out in early 1722, he had inoculated somewhere in the range of 240 people, including Harvard students and prominent Boston families, and he could account for every one of them. 6 died. 6 out of roughly 240. Call it 1 in 40. Meanwhile, out in the city, among people who caught smallpox the ordinary way, the toll was closer to 1 in 7. Boston as a whole lost around 850 people out of a population of about 11,000. More than 14% of the town, gone in a matter of months, 1 in 40 against 1 in 7. That's the entire argument, and it's not close. What Boylston had done without quite knowing it was run something very close to a clinical trial and publish the results. He wrote them up and presented them in London. The numbers traveled better than the shouting did. Over the following decades, inoculation spread through the American colonies and through England, not because the theory was persuasive, there was no theory, but because the arithmetic was. This is worth pausing on. Nobody in 1722 knew what smallpox was. Nobody knew what immunity was. There was no microscope image, no mechanism, no explanation of any kind. The case for inoculation rested entirely on counting, on a surgeon with no degree writing down what happened to each patient and being willing to publish the deaths along with the survivals. That habit, count everything, report the failures, let the numbers decide, is younger than you'd think, and this is one of the places it was born. What inoculation cost? Still be honest about what they were choosing. Inoculation was not safe. It was less deadly. Those are different things, and the difference is measured in real people. 1 in 40 still died. Somebody's child, walking into a room healthy and coming out in a coffin, because their parents made a bet on their behalf and lost. Those deaths were unlike any others, because someone had caused them on purpose. Every practitioner knew the arithmetic said, keep going. Every practitioner also had to face a family and explain. And the contagion problem never went away. An inoculated patient carried transmissible smallpox for weeks. Done carelessly, inoculation didn't just risk the patient. It lit fires in the community. Some towns banned it outright for exactly that reason, and they weren't being superstitious. It was also expensive. Weeks of preparation, isolation in a special house, a physician's fees. It became, in practice, a thing for people who could afford to stop working for a month. The poor caught smallpox the natural way, at 1 in 7, while the merchant class bought their way down to 1 in 40. In several cities, that gap turned into riots. So this is where the century sits. Humanity has, for the first time, a tool that works. And the tool is dangerous, contagious, unequal, and morally exhausting. Everyone using it knew they were making a bargain. What they needed was a way out of the bargain. The general who chose the risk. Before that way out arrives, there's one more chapter. And for Americans, it's the one that decided the country. When the Revolutionary War began, smallpox came with it. It always followed armies. Armies are exactly what a virus wants. Thousands of young men from scattered farms, most never exposed, packed into camps. And here the two sides were not evenly matched. British regulars mostly came from cities where smallpox circulated constantly. A large share had already had it as children and were immune. American recruits came from farms and villages where it might not appear for a decade at a stretch. The British Army was substantially protected. The Continental Army was a field of dry grass. It showed immediately. In the campaign against Quebec in 1776, smallpox tore through the American force, by some accounts infecting something near 40% of the troops there. And the invasion collapsed, not because of British tactics, because of a virus. John Adams wrote about it in something close to despair, calling the pox a worse enemy than the British and their allies combined. George Washington understood the problem personally. He had survived smallpox as a young man in Barbados, and he carried the scars. He knew what it did to a body and what it would do to an army. He also knew that inoculation was, from a general's point of view, close to insane. It meant deliberately infecting his own soldiers with a live disease, taking thousands of them out of the line for weeks at the worst possible moment, and hoping the enemy didn't find out. If word leaked that half the Continental Army was in a fever tent, the war could end that month. In February 1777, he did it anyway. He ordered mandatory inoculation of every recruit who had not already had smallpox. And he wrote to Congress that necessity did not merely authorize the measure. It required it. The inoculations were done in secret, in waves, in Philadelphia and Morristown and elsewhere, so that the army was never entirely down at once. It was the first mass immunization campaign in American history, and it was carried out by a commander who could not afford to lose and chose the risk anyway. Smallpox deaths in the Army fell to a small fraction of what they had been. Historians have argued for 2 centuries about which decisions won that war. This one belongs in the conversation. And notice what it rested on: a chain of knowledge that started with African and Asian and Turkish practitioners, passed through an enslaved man in Boston, survived a bomb through a window, and ended up on the desk of a general in a winter camp. A rumor in dairy country. Now the way out of the bargain, and it comes from the least dramatic place imaginable. In the dairy counties of Western England, there was a piece of common knowledge that had been floating around for generations, the kind of thing everyone half believed and nobody wrote down. The milkmaids didn't get smallpox. Cows got a disease called cowpox, sores on the udder, a mild nuisance. Milkmaids who handled infected udders picked up a few pox on their hands, ran a low fever for a couple of days, and got over it. And afterward, this was the part people repeated: smallpox seemed to leave them alone. Inoculators in dairy country had noticed something odd, too. When they tried to inoculate a milkmaid, sometimes nothing happened at all. The dose wouldn't take, as if she'd already had the disease she'd never had. Edward Jenner was a country doctor in Gloucestershire. He'd trained in London under a serious anatomist, but he'd chosen to go home and practice among farmers, and he had a naturalist's habits. The same man wrote the paper that finally proved cuckoos really do evict their foster siblings from the nest. He was a professional noticer. He was also, in this matters, a man with a personal grudge. He had been variolated as a boy, in the brutal style of the time. Weeks of purging and bleeding and starvation to prepare him, then the infection, then a stable full of other prepared children waiting it out together. He never really talked about it. He never forgot it. Jenner did not invent the cowpox idea. He'd have told you that himself. At least one man had already acted on it. A Dorset farmer named Benjamin Jesty, who in 1774, with smallpox in his village, walked his wife and 2 sons to a neighbor's cow, scraped matter from an infected udder, and scratched it into their arms with a stocking needle. They were protected. His neighbors treated him as a monster for years. He didn't publish. He wasn't a scientist. He was a father solving a problem in front of him. What Jenner did that Jesty didn't was test it systematically and then tell everyone. The 14th of May. In May of 1796, a dairymaid named Sarah Nelmes came to Jenner with a rash on her hand. He recognized cowpox. She'd picked it up from a cow named Blossom. Jenner had been waiting for this. On the 14th of May, 1796, he took matter from a sore on Sarah Nelmes's hand and made 2 shallow cuts, each about half an inch long, in the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps, the son of his gardener. Phipps got mildly sick. A little fever, some restlessness, a sore arm, pox that came and went. Within days he was fine. Then came the part that decides everything, and there is no way to describe it that makes it comfortable. On the 1st of July, 6 weeks later, Jenner deliberately infected that same child with real smallpox. Live variolous matter, the same procedure Boylston had used in Boston, cut into the arm of a healthy 8-year-old. If Jenner was wrong, the boy would get smallpox. If Jenner was very wrong, the boy would die. Nothing happened. No pustule at the site. No fever. No disease. Jenner tried again later. Still nothing. The cowpox had shut the door. We should not skip past what that means. A country doctor tested a hypothesis on his gardener's child. In a world with no ethics boards, no consent forms, no oversight of any kind. The test worked, and because it worked, a boy lived, and hundreds of millions of people lived after him. If it hadn't worked, we'd be telling this as a story about a physician who killed a child out of arrogance. Both of those stories were live on the 1st of July, 1796. Only one of them happened. That's not a detail to be embarrassed about and hurry past. It's the actual shape of how this was won. A great deal of what we take for granted was bought with risks nobody today would be allowed to take. on behalf of people who were in no position to refuse. Rejected Jenner wrote it up and sent it to the Royal Society, the summit of British science. They turned him down. Not enough evidence. And less officially, what he was claiming was at variance with everything known, and he was advised that pushing it would ruin his reputation. He went back to Gloucestershire and did more. He waited for cowpox to reappear, gathered more cases, and answered the question that made the whole thing usable. Whether the protection could pass from one person to the next, arm to arm, without a cow in the room. It could. He took matter from one vaccinated person's arm, put it into the next, and the chain held. That's what turned a curiosity of dairy country into something you could spread across a continent. In June of 1798, he published it himself, at his own expense, a slim book of 75 pages, an inquiry into the causes and effects of the variolae vaccinae, Latin, variola for smallpox, vacca for cow, the disease of the cow. That's where the word vaccine comes from. Every vaccine ever made, polio, measles, tetanus, everything, is named after a cow in Gloucestershire because of this book. The reaction was mixed and often hostile. The most famous cartoon of the era shows Jenner's patients sprouting cows out of their faces and arms, and it's funny until you realize people meant it. Putting animal matter into a human body struck many as a violation of something they couldn't quite name. Clergy called it unnatural. Some physicians with a financial stake in the old procedure discovered principled objections to the new one. But the thing about vaccination was that it did not require anyone to be persuaded of a theory. It required them to compare two options: variolation, real smallpox, weeks of isolation, 1 death in 40, contagious the whole time; vaccination, a sore arm, a couple of bad days, not contagious, and, as far as anyone could measure, nobody died. That comparison won. It won faster than almost anything in the history of medicine. Within 3 years, vaccination had crossed Europe. Within a decade, it had reached most of the world that had ships. The thread in the glass vial. It reached America on a thread. Benjamin Waterhouse, a physician at Harvard, had been corresponding with Britain about Jenner's work. In the summer of 1800, he obtained what he needed: a thread soaked in cowpox lymph, sealed in a glass vial and carried across the Atlantic. He tested it the way everyone tested things in that century. He vaccinated his own children and members of his household, and then had them exposed to smallpox to see whether it held. It held. Then he went further. On an island in Boston Harbor, 19 children were vaccinated and then deliberately exposed to smallpox in a pox hospital. Every one of them was fine. It was a public demonstration in the most literal sense, an experiment designed to be witnessed on children, because that was the only argument the public would accept. His most important ally was Thomas Jefferson. Waterhouse sent him a pamphlet with a title that now reads like prophecy: A Prospect of Exterminating the Smallpox. Jefferson wrote back that every friend of humanity had reason to be glad, that one more evil had been taken out of the human condition. Jefferson didn't just endorse it. He ran a vaccination operation out of Monticello, working through the problem that nearly killed vaccination in its first years: keeping the material alive. Cowpox lymph on a thread degraded in heat. Jefferson experimented with sealing it in glass, packing it in water, timing the shipments. He organized the vaccination of roughly 200 people around Monticello and passed material to other physicians, including, at his direction, toward native nations, in a country where smallpox brought by Europeans had already killed on a scale that is difficult to write down. And when you look at that scene, a president in a house built and run by enslaved people, some of whom were vaccinated because he decided they would be, sending threads of cowpox out to strangers, you're looking at the whole tangle. The good is real. The coercion is real. They're in the same room, at the same table, and pretending otherwise is how history gets turned into a bedtime story. How it actually got everywhere. The romantic version stops at Jenner. The real work took another 180 years, and most of it was logistics and argument. The material was the first problem. Living virus doesn't travel. Before refrigeration, before glycerin preservation, the only reliable way to carry vaccine over a long distance was inside a human body. Arm to arm, one person to the next, a living chain. In 1803, a Spanish expedition sailed for the Americas and the Philippines carrying 22 orphan boys, vaccinating 2 at a time in sequence, so the virus would still be alive when the ship made land. The chain was kept intact by a woman named Isabel Zendal, the orphanage's caretaker, who went with them and looked after the children on that voyage and beyond. The vaccine reached the other side of the world because a group of orphans were used as a container, and one woman kept them alive. That method carried its own price. Arm-to-arm transfer moved other things along with cowpox, including syphilis, in cases that became scandals. Vaccine got contaminated. Batches failed. Some people were vaccinated with material that did nothing and believed themselves protected until smallpox proved otherwise. The critics of vaccination were not always wrong, and pretending they were makes the story useless. The second problem was consent. As governments realized vaccination worked, they made it compulsory, and compulsion produced organized resistance. England's vaccination acts in the mid-1800s made it mandatory and then criminalized refusal, fining, and jailing parents. That produced one of the first mass anti-vaccination movements in history, marching in the streets of Leicester with banners. In the United States, a smallpox outbreak in Massachusetts led to a fine of $5 for a man named Henning Jacobson who refused vaccination, and in 1905, the Supreme Court decided against him, a ruling on the power of a state to compel a medical procedure for public health that is still argued about today. None of these were simple. A government forcing a needle into an unwilling citizen is a serious thing. A parent's child dying of a preventable disease is also a serious thing. There was no version of this century that didn't hurt, and underneath the arguing, the numbers moved. Country by country, decade by decade, smallpox got rarer, then rare, then strange. The last person on Earth. By the mid-20th century, smallpox had vanished from wealthy countries entirely and was still killing roughly 2 million people a year everywhere else. In the 20th century alone, it is estimated to have killed around 300 million people, more than every war of that century put together. In 1967, the World Health Organization launched a campaign to eliminate it completely, not reduce it, end it. It was possible for a very specific set of reasons. Smallpox lives only in humans. No animal reservoir, nowhere to hide. It's visible. You can see who has it, and it doesn't spread easily from a distance. That meant you didn't have to vaccinate everyone on Earth. You had to find every case and vaccinate the ring of people around it, and starve the virus of anywhere to go. So that's what happened, one case at a time. Health workers walked into villages with photographs, asking people if they'd seen this. They followed rumors. They vaccinated the family, the neighbors' neighbors. They did this in war zones and famine zones, across borders that were closed, in the middle of a Cold War, funded by countries that agreed on almost nothing else and cooperated on this. The circle closed. In 1975, a 2-year-old girl in Bangladesh named Rahima Banu became the last person in the world to have naturally acquired the deadlier form of the disease. She survived. 2 years later, in October 1977, a hospital cook in Merka, Somalia, named Ali Ma'ul Malin, developed a rash. He was the last case of naturally occurring smallpox on this planet. He recovered and spent his later life going village to village, vaccinating children against polio on the theory that he owed something. There was one more death. In 1978, a medical photographer in Birmingham, England, named Janet Parker caught smallpox from a research laboratory in the same building. She died in September of that year. She is the last person known to have died of it. Her case is a reminder that even after you beat something, it still exists in freezers, and that people still have to decide what to do about that. On the 8th of May, 1980, The World Health Assembly declared that smallpox had been eradicated from the world. It has not come back. It is the only human disease we have ever done this to. The absence. Here's the strange thing about winning. If you were born in the United States after about 1972, you don't have the scar. Your parents or grandparents might. That dime-sized circle of pitted skin on the upper arm. The one you probably noticed as a kid and never asked about. That mark is the last physical trace, on living human bodies, of a war that lasted 3,000 years. And that's the whole problem with this story. The reward for winning is that nothing happens. No one alive in this country has watched a child's face disappear under pustules. No one plans a family around the assumption that some of the children won't make it past the pox. The Boston of 1721, half the city infected, 1 in 7 dead, carts leaving in the dark, is not a memory anymore. It's not even a fear. It's just gone. And the goneness is so complete that we mistake it for the natural state of things. It isn't. It was built. It was built out of knowledge that Europe ignored for a century because it came from Africa and Asia and from a woman and a man in chains. It was built by a surgeon who hid in his own house from a mob and wrote down his dead patients' names anyway. It was built by a general who infected his own army in the middle of a war he was losing. It was built by a country doctor who cut cowpox into a boy's arm and then, 6 weeks later, cut smallpox into it. And by a boy who wasn't asked. It was built by 22 orphans on a ship, passing a virus hand to hand across an ocean. It was built by health workers walking into Somali villages with a photograph, asking, "Have you seen anyone who looks like this?" Every one of them was working with incomplete information. Most of them were, by the standards we'd apply now, doing something indefensible. All of them were guessing, and the ones we remember are the ones who guessed right. Ali Mao Malin, the last man on earth to catch smallpox naturally, spent his last decades walking into villages to vaccinate other people's children. And he used to tell parents that he had seen the disease, that he knew what it did, and that they should not let their children find out. He died in 2013 of malaria, still doing it. The scar on your grandmother's arm isn't a mark of illness. It's a receipt. Somebody paid for the fact that you have never had to think about this, not once in your entire life.